Hello, welcome to today's webinar. Actually, I'm really excited that we're going to be having this conversation. The research, the report that we managed to produce on this particular topic, I think is one of the most fascinating we've done. And well, we are asking questions about do buyers and suppliers operate in parallel universes? Because the truth is that we have way too many disagreements, claims, disputes, often avoidable. And we're going to be digging into why that happens. So perhaps only my excitement about the topic is outdone only by the excitement I have about my co-presenter today. Faye Jack has, gosh, Faye, you've been a member of WorldCC, ICCM, as it was, of course, when you joined, for many years now. We've had all sorts of opportunities over those years to interact in a variety of different guises as your tremendous career has progressed to a point where you, just over a year ago now, I think, set up Resolution. Did you want to just tell us quickly what drove you to doing that?
Absolutely. So I have worked in a range of different commercial roles, as you know, contract management, procurement, started my career in legal and across a range of industries. And in that work, as a practitioner, leading teams, one of the things that really stood out to me was conflict and the effect that that has on successful commercial relationships. And there's such an opportunity to drive so much progress in this area. I decided to take a leap and move over to technology to support this community in building kind of better, more collaborative relationships and really getting to the root cause of conflict and disputes and resolving it.
Well, that's certainly a noble ambition, and one, of course, that we absolutely share, because we all know that contracts should be invaluable assets, yet often they're diminished into a sort of bit part role rather than being center stage. And well, in a way, they shouldn't be center stage. They should be driving levels of harmony and creativity. And we're going to dig a bit more into why that maybe doesn't happen as much and as often as it should. And of course, we all know about the famous value erosion, the opportunity to really deliver a phenomenal return on investment through better contracting. Um, do please, as always, participate, use chat to talk to us. We'll be monitoring that and looking for your interesting comments and observations, your questions, your howls of outrage as we put forward a few contentious points of view, perhaps once or twice on our journey. So do participate. And of course, as always, start off by just saying hello and telling us where you're from. It's always wonderful to see the diversity of our audiences here for these sessions. So let's go and start our journey. I think well, it's a serious matter, isn't it, Faye? These claims, these disputes.
It is indeed. When you look at the numbers and certainly what came out of the research, Tim, there's so much wasted, not just money, but also effort, and there's damaged relationships. And I think the main thing is that so much of this is avoidable. And so it's why we're not doing more. And that's kind of the crux of the research. We need to do more as a community in this space.
And of course, that second comment there, calculations to only include direct cost and published data is really important, isn't it? Because so many of the big disagreements, disputes, don't meet the public eye at all. So this is just the stuff that gets visible because it becomes public. So we don't know what proportion that is. But we know in some industries it tends to be quite a small proportion, isn't it? Because as soon as you start moving, for example, into mediation, for example, it's not actually going to be a published result.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just from my experience, most, as you said, most conflict, most disputes, they settle. So even if you do kick off some kind of legal process, it's very unlikely that matters go to court. So you're absolutely right. We don't have the true number, and parties are very good at settling at some point. But what the research has pointed to, and certainly from experience, I think things are often left too late. So that process of dialogue, of conflict, of disputes can take months, if not years. And that's just far too long. And that is where a lot of this financial erosion comes from.
Well, of course, it can be the driver, I guess, for resolution. I mean, in the sense that if you look at levels of litigation in India, it's really low. That's because typically to get to court, it's going to take 10 to 15 years. So you're sort of driven to an alternative approach, aren't you? So maybe maybe a speedy legal resolution system is not a good thing.
It's interesting because I think even if we think about courts in different areas, the US, the UK included, they expect parties to engage in some kind of mediation process. And that's often where things are resolved. So I think actually the question is, why don't you do that sooner? And for those kind of countries and cultures that don't have those long processes, what are they doing to fix things sooner without these drawn out processes? I think there's things to learn across countries, cultures, and industries.
Certainly is, and we'll, I think, come back to that briefly a little bit later. So, well, we kicked off on this research. Let's go and look at our next slide, which will give us a little bit, I think, of a background, a backdrop to what we were doing here. And you came to us, of course, towards the end of last year and said, this is really an area we need to dig into. And you were absolutely right, and I'm so glad we did. Um, and it did generate a lot of interest. I think we were pleasantly surprised by, I think, 495 different organizations that contributed to this study. And we've been able to do some desk work behind the scenes, as well as the conversations we've been able to have. So it's, I think, a pretty robust picture, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I also like the split, it's very balanced. And I think that's really important when research is done. What are the different viewpoints? And we've got 50% buy side, 50% sell side. I think that's brilliant. I think there's one point to kind of pick out early, Tim, and that's the use of the word dispute. So we talked about this between us, but in this research, dispute means an escalated disagreement. It doesn't necessarily mean litigation. I think that's really important context to put on this, and also as we go through kind of the findings.
It is important because, yes, again, we found that across different industries, we can't even agree what we mean when we use the word dispute. So even arguing over the word dispute gives us an opportunity to dispute with each other, which does ask us a little bit about human characteristics, doesn't it? Do we just love arguing so much that actually we want disputes? Let's um, let's go and have a start looking at what is generating a lot of this sort of activity. Well, frequency of disagreement. We touched already on the costs of what we were able to observe if you add together direct and indirect cost. Um, so That's 1 in 5. Now, of course, that doesn't include consumer contracts. We are very clear here. We're really talking about business to government. And we'll also come later to the fact that it's, as you said, inconsistent across jurisdictions and inconsistent across industries. But that's a pretty high probability rate of a major escalated disagreement, isn't it?
It's incredibly high, and I think um, it's interesting because and this came out in the report, the numbers of people who actually track this metric and also track what it costs to them. We're seeing that consistently people don't tend to track it, and it really is something that they should be tracking and keeping on top of. And I think one of the things that there was consensus of, even though we didn't have consensus on the term of dispute, is that if it's left unchecked, it does erode trust, it does stifle innovation, it does slow progress. So this is an area where I think we're all agreed we need to invest some time and some thought into. And that's almost an early call to action before we get to those later on in this presentation.
Well, certainly within our Research and Learning Council, there's been a lot of conversation, as you know, on a slightly different angle of this, which is the likelihood of rebidding, potential early termination, and the
Mm.
extent to which niggles, you have to call them, start off, they start to erode confidence, they turn into disagreements, pointing fingers, blame, and rather than actually look at how to remediate the relationship, it's just all too easy to say somebody else will be better. Let's just switch.
Yeah, I think most organizations, they do aspire to build collaborative relationships, but there is something that happens in the kind of in the process of time that erodes that. And you've kind of touched on some of it, but there's communication breakdowns, misaligned objectives. They all lie at the heart of these tensions that we see that start to build up. And I think that, and we've got this here on the slide, with the volatility we're seeing today in the market conditions, this is going to get much worse. Conflict is going to get worse, and we do really need to do something about it.
Well, that's absolutely borne out, of course, by the typical cause of disputes, the triggers that we looked at in the study. And I think our next slide may actually take us to some of those triggers. Well, because, of course, the point is that for those who do spend time aggregating this experience, we get to know what goes wrong. I mean, I always feel all of this a little bit like warranty claims. If I was selling mugs and the handle regularly fell off, I've got a choice, haven't I? I can either try and remediate the handle falling off and understand why and what I need to do to strengthen the handle, or I can just accept customer complaints and send a new mug out every time. But certainly the intelligent route would be to say, what's causing this and how do I remediate? We don't seem to do that. And very historically, that could have been quite difficult because obviously we often lacked good systems to really give us insight to the repetitive issues. But even
Mm.
if we haven't got a system, we could communicate with our colleagues and we could actually sort of crowdsource the answer to this, couldn't we?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I have always advocated is post dispute or post conflict management. And what that means is almost a lesson learned exercise. If you've had conflict, if you've had an issue, a disagreement that has escalated, taking the time to sit down and say, okay, why did this happen? What was the root cause? What are the common themes that we're seeing? And then the next step is, okay, well, what do we do about this so that it doesn't keep repeating, as with your analogy? And that's a really important process that many contracts commercial teams don't do, but should. And you don't need a system for that. It's something that you can do manually, but it's well worth the time and investment.
So let's move on to my next slide and let's look at some of those underlying issues, the triggers for the disputes. And we've just focused on the top three here. The report itself gives rather more detail, but well, do these surprise you, or is this in line with what you would have expected?
Absolutely what I expected. It's nice to see alignment again, but we do see some differences, and that is the bit that I wasn't expecting. So for buyers, number one was changing needs and requirements, while sellers was ambiguous missing terms. Um, there may be a reason behind that. I think that's quite interesting in and of itself, but we do see some consistency between the top three, which I expected.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting that on the sell side, actually, the issues around contract terms about number one and number three, we gave people an option of ambiguity or missing. Um, and to what extent, though, do you think these are in fact issues related to the changing market conditions and changing needs and requirements that our contracts uh, fall short when it comes to that management of change. And so we suddenly find we're getting into disagreement and we pull out the contract and it's got nothing relevant to deal with the situation. We definitely saw that with COVID, didn't we? We saw that very often contracts really hadn't properly dealt with issues around inflation. We certainly see now, we just issued a report 2 weeks ago about the challenge with tariffs that once again contracts in many cases fall short when it comes to, oh my God, we're going to get a 25% tariff. What are we going to do?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think on this point, it's really important. We talk about this all the time. Contracts need to be flexible. They need to be flexible to be able to shift in line with changes, just like you've illustrated with COVID, but things that could come in the future as well. And what is interesting about this is that we know that a lot of organizations use standard forms. And it may be that that power imbalance when you receive a standard form as a supplier is what is driving missing contract terms. Perhaps there are things that you know are very relevant to the service you're providing or goods you're providing and need to be in the contract. There's no room for them if it's a standard document. So there is a piece about getting together and building agreements that are flexible, but also that reflect a shared understanding of the goals and drivers, and some real alignment so that you don't get these kind of triggers having such an impact that they currently have. I think also consistency and accountability is often missing in this. And those mechanisms for flexibility, adaptability, they are so important and they contradict the kind of control that people often focus on instead. It's not control, it's about flexibility so that overall relationship can work, not just for the time at which it's contracted, but for the long term.
Now, Bruno has made a comment, and I think relating back to our statistic of 1 in 5. 1 in 5 was our average. Actually, the interesting point is that on the procurement side, people said 1 in 6, and on the supply side, they said 1 in 4. So, as I say, 1 in 5 was our average. Um, it, it is a high number, and of course, it's not consistent across all industries. Clearly, the shorter term an agreement, the less powerful, very often too, one of the counterparties is can really reduce the frequency of dispute. But we will be talking about the industries where this is particularly prevalent shortly. But any thoughts, any feedback as far as Bruno is concerned on the volume that we're talking about here?
I think the overarching point is that it is very high. And that's why we need to put more focus on it. Absolutely. What you've mentioned we'll go through later in this, but it is a big number. And whilst it varies depending on industries, this research has uncovered that this is an area that we actually need to put more focus on. And it's an encouragement for organizations to start to track this data to see, well, what does this mean for me in my industry, in my business, and what are we seeing specifically? Because averages are great, but it's important you understand your own environment and what that means for you.
And Emma raises what to me is an important point, having spent more of my career on sell side than buy side, that frustration of being given via a standard template that maybe has no relevance to the industry, to the nature of what it is I'm going to be supplying. Um, so, as she rightly says, does that not argue for actually using the supplier's paper? But of course, the supplier's paper often isn't used because, from a buyer's point of view, it's a self-interested and not particularly balanced perspective. So, what do we do there, Faye?
Yeah, and this is interesting because there is um this kind of move to standard terms. We see a lot of standard terms flying around. I think ultimately what that leads to is a sense of unfairness. You start with terms that don't really capture what it needs to capture. And from the supplier's perspective, they often enter into these relationships thinking, oh, there's stuff missing. And actually, what happens as time goes on is that you find the impact of the things that are missing is so material that actually I would suggest what needs to happen is that goal sharing up front. What are our objectives? What are our goals for this contract? Making sure time is taken to shape something that actually reflects the supply, um, the goals, the ambitions, the intent behind entering into the relationship, because that is what's going to give you the best foundation as you continue through the relationship.
Yes, and there's been, in fact, we've been looking at some work, looking at the impact of standards. And while they can, of course, sometimes accelerate the contracting process, not always, but I think a lot of the evidence suggests that, unfortunately, the inflexibility of standards often creates an inappropriate environment for success.
Yeah.
Um, so we do, though, I guess, have an optimistic note there, which is actually with the advent of AI, the ability increasingly to perhaps create market appropriate or product or service appropriate terms, utilizing more of a standardized database rather than a fixed template,
Mhm.
does begin to give us that opportunity to combine standards with a level of situational customization.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I often do when I talk to organizations and we look at contracts that have issues, I say, okay, well, tell me what your goals were, tell me what your intent was. And I'd look at the contract and I'd show them, well, none of that's actually captured. And I think that's the big challenge. You've got a nice contract that covers all the legal terms and all of the defensive provisions. But when it comes to actually what's being delivered and what you're hoping to achieve through the commercial relationship, it's rarely reflected in the required depth.
Now, Ramesh makes a very interesting comment, I think, probably picking up on the fact that we talked about India and the Indian courts and therefore the low levels of litigation. And he comments about the fact that its reputation of performance is critical, which of course neither of us would disagree with. And I think both of us would advocate that buying organizations should be paying far more attention to the performance record of their supplier. You know, all too often you look at some of the big disputes and you say, why on earth were they in business with that particular supplier? I mean, they've got a history of repetitive failure. Where have these guys in procurement been? Um, so, trying to build, I think, more um, example, or rather better analysis of a supplier's competence and capability to deliver is important. But what Ramesh goes on to say is obviously that reputation gives confidence about future performance. Reputation effect ensures renewal and opens lateral opportunities, so disputes are low. Now, again, we've done a little bit of research in this area, and one of the big differences for Indian firms has been that and I look particularly, for example, at outsourcing. If you look at the average margin of the big Western providers, the US, European providers, they're typically operating on margins of somewhere between 6 and a top 13%. Indian providers are typically operating with margins of around 25%. And one of the big differences there is, of course, or has been, the disparity in labor costs. So, a big advantage for the Indian providers has often been the affordability of throwing people at problems, which, of course, as they succeed more and more, is going to diminish more and more as an affordable option. Uh, Comments on that hypothesis, Faye?
Well, agreed, because that's kind of been my understanding as well. I think there's a piece around flexibility. If there are changes during the term of a commercial relationship, if there are changing requirements or needs and margins are lower, and this is more generalized, you don't always have the flexibility to adapt. And I think that's also a financial driver as well. Often, a lot of the conflict and disputes sit around, well, if you want me to now do this, it's going to cost this much. And there's no room in the margins for us to deliver it without us looking at the pricing and kind of renegotiating. And I think that's a big piece and kind of links to the comment that's been made. There's not always the room financially for that flexibility.
Mm. No, it's certainly true. Yeah, well, and again, look at an industry like construction and the number of suppliers that go out of business, and you can obviously immediately see that margin is not offering flexibility. Um, we've got, I think Bruno had come back with another comment, which actually, Bruno, we will be picking up shortly, I think, with some of our further commentary here. So let's we now know what the triggers are. We now know the causes of dispute are. So let's go and see what might underpin some of it. It's a big question. Why does it happen? So, Navisha, let's start to look at the answer. Let's move on because I think a couple of and this, in a sense, led to our title for the webinar today, Faye. We've got two interesting psychological issues to explore here, haven't we?
We do indeed. I think the optimism was incredibly interesting. This optimism bias that we see happening in relationships. I don't know if there's a slide later, but that would be a big one to explore, I think, because ultimately what the research found was that people think their relationships are brilliant. Um, But actually, the findings are that there are actually issues and problems. So there is this conflict between this optimistic view of the state of the relationship and the reality of what's going on.
Yep. So, of course, this was referencing a big study that we undertook at WorldCC back in 2017, 2018, 2018, actually published 2019, with organizational psychologists from University of California, Irvine, where we thought that maybe one of the big problems with people in legal and contracting was that we're just natural pessimists. But actually, the research found that about 2,000, I think, people participated in it, that the legal and contracting professionals are, in fact, somewhat more optimistic than the average member of the public, but they undergo a personality change in the workplace. And it was that which led the psychologists to describe that behavior as preventist, more focused on protecting assets than actually enabling the growth of assets. But there's a bit of a contrast, isn't there? So let's go and carry on looking at why this creates a bit of a problem. So first of all, the problem we see is the weighting towards this vigilant behavior, this prevention, means that contracts tend to be viewed much more as instruments of control. And to Anton's point, we don't endeavor to design them for a user community. We're designing them almost like we expect conflict to occur. Um, so we don't want our language to be clear and easily understood because very often it's not altogether reasonable. Or by making it more complicated, we think maybe we can turn it to our advantage later on and claim, oh, no, that's not what we meant at all. Um, so it is this rigidity that in a fast-moving external environment becomes a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this analogy that I mentioned to you earlier about defensiveness. So when I was looking at the kind of the results and the rigidity and the prevention, this kind of focus, I thought, well, if you think about sports, you cannot just defend. You have to look at how you drive success. And I think particularly when you think about buyers and suppliers who are supposed to be collaborating, supposed to be on the same team, so to speak, in that they should both sides be striving for success. This focus on defense makes things quite difficult, I think. And it's how do we get that right balance between risk management, which is definitely important, but also the other side, the focus and the mechanisms to drive success in the relationship, which is actually very different.
It is. It is. So that's the contract. So we've got this defensive view when it comes to a contract, but I think our next slide is going to tell us that we have a bit of a personality shift along the route. So that led us to this interesting question of what planet are we on?
Absolutely. It's interesting just seeing the numbers here. And it's what I alluded to before that the quality of relationships, everyone thinks it's really high. The big numbers are all at high, very high, good, excellent. Um, but there are material issues that need to be dealt with. And actually, most negotiated terms, linking back to that, when we thought about what are the things that cause the issues, it's scope of work that's really pushed. Here we're seeing, okay, well, what are the triggers that cause conflict and disputes once you've signed in that kind of post-management, post-signature management phase? You look at that and then you look at these scores and you think, oh, but everyone thinks it's going swimmingly. So there is something there is something here about the optimism. And again, it's about us all doing that work on the data to understand actually what is the true nature of our
Mm.
relationships and possibly getting some feedback. So, how many buyers or suppliers go to their counterparts and ask for feedback? What is it like working with me? What's your view on the relationship and how it's gone to date? I don't think as many as should go through that activity to really understand the true nature of relationships.
Well, it takes us back to the view that many in the business have, of course, which is it's not the contract that matters, it's the relationship that counts. And so we delude ourselves into believing we're really good at having positive relationships with people. So, 75% of buyers, 87% of suppliers believes that their relationship with their customer or their supplier is better than the average, which obviously is mathematically impossible. So we are clearly deluding ourselves. We presumably don't really benchmark effectively the quality of the relationship we offer. We probably like to believe that we're a customer of choice or a supplier of choice. And then, of course, at the bottom there, that equally somewhat delusional view of trust, because there's a very narrow definition of trust there, isn't it? Because you start digging into it, and a study we've been doing recently. How often do suppliers share detailed cost data with their customer? I mean, if you really want to drive value in the relationship, you have to both be quite open with each other about the cost base. Otherwise, you can't see the opportunities for improvement. How many suppliers are happy giving their customer detailed information about their supply chain? Not many, because we know that most buyers struggle to get that data from their suppliers. Um, why? Because their suppliers, well, partly because their suppliers actually don't know the answer, but even when they do know the answer, they don't trust the customer with the information. Similarly, why don't I give you cost information? Because I don't trust how you're going to use it. So, do we really see good evidence of meaningful trust, Faye?
I think the answer is no. But the data seems to suggest that we do. I think there's this uncovered that there's a lot of opportunity, I would say, to really consider how we build greater trust in the relationships. You've pulled out some really good examples. Um, yeah, it's food for thought for all of us.
Well, we are in a commercial relationship. We are operating in a competitive world. So how much information I'm really going to divulge, I think is quite reasonable to say in most cases, I'm not going to expose myself to a degree that is risky for me to expose myself, because the truth is, you may promise me today that you're never going to divulge the information I share with you, but actually, a year from now, you may be thinking, oh, there's a better offer over there. So, will your integrity survive that better offer? Um, so perhaps the real point here is we need to be honest with ourselves about the true level of trust, and we need to be honest with ourselves about the true quality of the relationship we have. If we continue down this path of superiority complex and optimism bias, we don't confront the real challenge and we don't put the mechanisms in place to deal with conflicts.
Yeah, and I think there's also a piece of, well, what are we trusting the other party with? And there is a case for more openness when it comes to the state of the relationship in terms of the type of dialogue that you're having. So, for example, if you are having, your bi-weekly or monthly catch-ups, the depth of conversation there is really important, and that's an indicator of trust. So you should be talking about, what is the real state of the relationship beyond SLAs, etc. How is this really going? What are the issues that you're really seeing? Are we
Mm.
actually delivering to the standard that you expected? And being willing to have those hard conversations, I think that is a big reflection of trust, and that also goes a long way to actively preventing conflict and disputes down the line, because you're having those hard conversations up front so that you can work together to remedy things quickly as they arise.
So having the disciplined forums where discussion can occur, because all too often again, both buyers and suppliers just feel that when there are issues, they can quickly either, well, firstly, they may just be allowed to fester, but even if they're raised, they can often just disappear into a black hole, rather than actually having an established and well-constructed change management, escalation management, etc. So, and having problem-solving forums is one of the key characteristics of higher performing relationships. So I think we're beginning to get to wanting to put together a summary of answers for everybody. But before we go there, I think we've got another big topic, Navisha, haven't we, that we need to talk about. Third parties, that surely must be the answer. Let's just bring in third parties. Let's have somebody to help us with the negotiation phase. That's definitely going to help us because we can bring in experts. And hey, if that goes wrong, we can bring in somebody to help us through the dispute. And that keeps us removed from it. Our relationship can survive. Does that work well?
Well, I think the data tells the story in itself. So by third parties, when we did the research, what we meant was law firms, consultancies, arbitration processes, etc. And I think there is definitely a piece, and we touched on this earlier, it's what they've come in to do. So what isn't helpful is that when you reach conflict, you bring in an additional party to defend, because what that does is strains the relationship further, increases the timelines, because it creates a real back and forth battle. It increases costs. That is not helpful. So it's absolutely down to what role you need that third party to play and how they've been engaged into the relationship. I think ultimately it's for us as professionals to own those relationships rather than hand them off to somebody else. That's really, really important. And I also, just from experience, think that when you bring someone in, they have to be geared towards facilitation. How do we resolve the issue in the best interest of the commercial contractual relationship versus fight it out for the interest of just one party? That never
Mm,
succeeds in anything positive.
mm. Yeah, so setting the scene for the behaviors that you expect that third party to exhibit, I guess, is really important. I think what the survey's respondents told us that at least some advisory firms come in with a very aggressive attitude, perhaps very focused on traditional practices of just trying to drive down the price and pass as much risk across to the counterparty as possible. So creating that somewhat adversarial environment, so important there. If that's what you want them to do, by all means bring them in and have them behave that way, but of course recognize the downstream consequence of that, because you're going to have a lot of recovery to do from the pain of that. Um, and too often we see the employing organization abdicating responsibility to the third party and not maintaining at least that sort of senior level interaction to ensure that things are going the way we really wanted them to move.
Absolutely. And linked to what you said, if you are bringing a third party in and their mandate is not to build bridges, but rather to come in and defend, and that adversarial dynamic takes place, that is where you have to retain control, because things can really deteriorate in terms of the relationship, ultimately you have to remember that after the conflict or dispute is resolved, there is still a contractual relationship. There is still something that needs to be fulfilled, and you still have to work together. Therefore, you have to be really, really mindful as to how you resolve things during the course of the relationship. And as you said, the knock-on impact to maybe the 2, 3 years left in the contract where both sides have to work together.
Now, on the downside, of course, there are, I think, plenty of examples where bringing in an expert intermediary who is perhaps not a formal mediator or arbitrator, but is an expert who can comment on the uh, the perspectives of the two parties. So when a disagreement has arisen, bring somebody independent who can really advise and counsel. I know certainly in US construction, Jim Groton, friend who has many, many years, even more experience than me. I think he's in his 90s now, and still talks about the power of that independent intermediary and the frequency with which that can defuse a situation, because even if neither party is absolutely happy with the proposed outcome, if it's caught in the bud, very often they recognize the sense of settling and moving on. So I think there are clearly some real opportunities for having positive third-party experience, and it is important to register that, because we are not saying here, don't ever use third parties, just be conscious of what you're using them for and what consequences are likely to have.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, mediation globally across industries has a really high success rate. And that is why construction utilizes it a lot. It's over 90%. And that is because, exactly as you've described, they're coming in as a neutral and they're looking at what's in the best interest of the kind of relationship going forwards, and allowing the parties to kind of find some common ground that works going forwards. So there are different approaches you can take, and as you said, it's about being mindful of the fallout of those different avenues and being intentional about the approach that you take.
Okay, so we've looked at a lot of the underlying factors, and of course we want to get now to the areas where people can succeed. So a final quick comment about this one, and our next slide, I think, gives us a little bit more point here that, you know, actually, sadly, when it comes to post-award activity, top management often hasn't got the point, has it? It hasn't made the investment that's needed to really achieve good performance management.
Absolutely. I think in the next slide there is some more detail on this, but oh no, we're going back. I think absolutely, and there's different roles to play for different people. There's roles for leadership, roles for practitioners, but that performance piece is really important. So when we think about contracts, contracts are really important, but there are other things that flow into that. So I spoke to you about the kind of market dynamics, shifting business priorities, human factors. They are all linked to the contract, but they aren't written into the terms. So we need to think about these multiple kind of data points and factors that all feed into the relationship and feed into performance management, and not just the wording of the document itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the fragmented responsibility is a big thing, isn't it? Because, we're dealing obviously with, as we said before, increasingly volatile market conditions. We don't know what's going to hit us next, and we don't necessarily have fast paths to what we're going to do when stuff happens. Tariffs have been a case in point. Nobody was really taking them all that seriously. They thought it was probably more of a positioning than actually something that was going to happen. And even if it was going to happen, they probably expected there would be a reasonable amount of notice. And they also expected that when tariffs were announced, that they were then going to take effect, not that they were on today, off tomorrow. So we are working this chaotic environment that organizations generally don't have the escalation paths internally to say, which of our projects is this going to impact? Which of our contracts are hit by these particular situations? And again, we saw greater investment in trying to create that joined up visibility during COVID. I think effort then waned a little bit. But getting this connectivity across systems so that we've got quality data and clarity over whose job is it when something occurs to actually work out what to do about it is so important. And of course, when you haven't got those mechanisms in place, probably not surprising that it often takes so long to resolve things. And because of that duration, often the conflict grows. Let's
Absolutely.
just move to our next slide. I spotted a slight spelling error there. Um, it is, of course, meant to be tribal, not tribal. Um, really, the point being here, and I think we've got a couple of little pop-ups that will appear in just a moment. Um, some interesting variability that we spotted in the results, Faye.
Absolutely. So there is a difference across the industries and also the countries in terms of frequency of conflict and disputes, in terms of the ways in which they are resolved, in terms of the speed of resolution, and also in terms of the acceptance, which we can see in the bottom box. So there are some like construction energy, much more frequent, much more expensive. But I think overall there is something happening in just about every industry, but some are worse than others. I think the common law piece to draw out is that the formal legal action does not mean going to court. So this is just where claim forms are raised, litigation processes are instigated, but more often than not, settlements are reached before that. So that's an important point to draw out. It doesn't mean court processes.
And yeah, Mark makes the point it's important to understand the culture internally as well as externally. So, I mean, a clear warning sign ought to be for a buyer, for example, what industry am I working with here? What is the propensity or the typical behavior in that industry? Does it tend to be combative? We also have to appreciate that if we're dealing, as we often are in technology, for example, and increasingly in energy, with a highly innovative environment, that the propensity for disagreement is massively increased. So we need to structure our contract and our governance and our relationship accordingly. Construction, well, we know that in many countries, the construction industry does have a history. Even though they've tried to move towards more collaborative models, they still have great success in disagreeing. Um, so that sensitivity and planning for it is, again, common sense. So I think we now move to a couple of slides where we're going to summarize both from an executive level and then from a practitioner level, what is it that we can do differently? I mean, what this study has given us is a lot of insight, but the important thing is to turn that into action. So what do we think executives should be doing?
Absolutely. So we've talked about this in terms of actually measuring what's going on in your organization. So conflict, what is conflict about? What are the key themes? How frequently is it happening? Who is it happening with? These are all things we can start to track within our organizations to see how we can improve year on year. So there has to be an objective, and that is improvement. Um, in terms of the post-award capability, so you can't really invest effectively until you understand your landscape. But what you can do is knowing now from this research that it is an issue, look at the tools that you have in place. If you are a leader, look at the tools that your team have at their disposal to support them. And look at your kind of approach overall in terms of post-award management and how you deal with your buyer or supplier relationships. And then success. What does success look like? Well, actually, I think it's collaborative relationships that deliver the intended goals that you had at the start of the relationship. So, how do you get from A to B without friction, relationship degrading without financial loss. That's really important. And then you can kind of pick out the steps to get there. And then, of course, number four, contracts. So, how the contract is shaped is so important. It needs to be flexible, it needs to be able to adapt as the market changes, as needs and requirements change. Um, it needs to be able to adjust and respond to that, because that is, again, how you get to success without conflict and without issues. And that's how you drive the right performance on both sides. And then the approach to external intervention, we've mentioned this. It's about being intentional. If you want that adversarial environment, then by all means. But actually, to get to success, it's better to collaborate. And collaborate means that you need to be working together. And that friction, where you're fighting against each other, is not in the interest of the relationship overall. And it can also just distract you from the actual intent of the relationship. You end up in this web of fighting rather than recognizing, okay, there was an end goal here, and how do we best get to that versus getting distracted, fighting and flinging claims and settlement numbers around. So really
Yeah,
important actions for executives, certainly.
yeah, yeah. So winning the battle but losing the victory all too often the case. So now we also have a view for the practitioner, don't we? Because while, of course, we would absolutely love any executive listening in to be really thinking about how do I build this strategic capability, we've obviously also got a lot of practitioners who are probably dealing with a specific deal or a specific relationship. So does that mean, well, until the executives take action, there's nothing I can do?
Absolutely not. We are all leaders, is what I often say. So we've got here clarifying ambiguities early. This came out in one of the earlier slides. It's really important that there is some kind of tool to understand the contracts and make sure they are as clear as they can be, because ambiguities do cause issues because you'll often get different interpretations. So it starts with the document, make sure it's clear, unambiguous, as far as is possible. And then the decisions and deviations, change management. Make sure you are documenting everything that's changing, again, to make sure that the document that is underpinning the relationship is nice and clear, and if possible, a joint process so that you're aligned in that activity. Then, in terms of issues, dealing with them promptly, a lot of the erosion in terms of time, cost, risk happens when issues drag on. So, if you are faced with something, make sure there are mechanisms to deal with it quickly, because it means it's much simpler in the long run. And then that open dialogue. And it's not just about conversation, it's about the depth of conversation. So be bold, be willing to actually ask questions that may be uncomfortable, i.e., what do you think of us in terms of how we're delivering, in terms of the relationship? Because it means you can
Mm.
lean in and really deal with any issues that come out in the earlies rather than them festering in the background. And of course, learn and apply always. So we talked about the kind of post-dispute management. Make sure
Mhm.
you're tracking the relationships that you're looking after, the things that you're learning. Make sure that you're applying them in the future to continuously improve, and to reduce those issues reoccurring.
Yeah, real practical points. In fact, I came to this webinar, had to interrupt activity in a workshop between a big customer and big supplier who've been doing business with each other for many years, but actually do come together periodically just to have a facilitated session where they really step back and say, what are the goals and objectives we have? Are we really properly aligned? And are we optimizing the opportunities that we have? So, no matter, and I guess it's very much like in our personal relationships, there are moments where you really need to just step back and say, have we just fallen into a rut, or are we really enabling and supporting each other on a journey towards greater ambition and fulfillment? So this has been, I think, a phenomenal journey. As I said at the beginning, I love this report, and I thank our participants today very much for their comments, questions. We have, I think, done a fairly good job there, managing to address those as we went along, which is great news. And we certainly thank you very much for initiating this particular study. And I know that the slide deck does give where people can connect and contact you. But I'm sorry it's disappeared before it came up. But,
Fine.
um,
Find me on LinkedIn.
well, and of course, the trick is to make sure you're looking for resolution with two eyes. Many of us, and spell check, of course, sadly, can often change it back to one eye. But if you are looking to reach out to Faye, then please do go and find her at Resolution. Faye, thank you. And again, thank you very much to the audience.
Thank you.